Mini ma'am, as many of you may know, like she has worked with OAP for a long time, over 18 years from 2001 to 2019, and she has, produced till now she has to accredit some 105 she has edited, and in this big chunk goes to that, some 37 of it goes to the Modern Indian Novels in Translation, Mint series, right, published by Macmillan. And you, like many of you may have read those things. It had very interesting titles, like brought into India, like English, like Setu's Pandavapuram, and like in Tamil Vasaveshwaram, like Kirtika, Chandragiri Tiradali, like Sara Abubakar. That was made into a film in Tamil later, Jamila, like that, and it was released as in some other name in Tamil, Nadikare Nile. So, like, that was a very wonderful series. And Parasangata Gendatima, which Dr. Girida has translated, that was also part of that series. So that was that Mint series. Then again another, some 60 odd, things by, OEP and others. And right now she is, of course, the consulting editor with Tamil Nadu Textbook Corporation and Educational Services, right? Tamil Nadu Textbook and Educational Services Corporation. So they are, bringing in like Tamil literature into English translations of, Tamil literature, and many of the things that she's doing along with them, and these translations are published by like HarperCollins and New York Books and many like publishers like that. They collaborate with different people, and that was one thing. And she was the founding editor of that South Asia website for women writers, hosted by the British Council. She was the founding editor of that, and she was also the member of the first project advisory committee of NTM. So the idea with which NTM started, and she had a lot of inputs at that time, and it is in a kind of, since Dr. Tariq is also here, I would like to mention personal kind of serendipitous moment, in the sense, like in the beginning of like the NTM in 2010-11, that time she was the one, like in one of the meetings she mentioned like how we should bring this science fiction in Science Reporter, those things. Like it would be good if NTM brings in, right, to have a readership of that kind, So later, 10 years down the road, we get Dr. Tariq, who like ascends the throne here, like who takes the reign, and without knowing anything that has happened in the like in the past, like 10 years back, what has happened, what has gone into those meetings, because he personally has read those pieces and has been influenced as a student, from his student days he has read. He said we should do something like that. We should translate those things. And just this, September, like he met, the people in that NISCARE. Now it is NISPR, like CSAR NISPR, that science communication, people. And he has almost clinched a deal now to translate, those science fictions published in, like in Science Reporter. So, like, and to have both these people on the same platform today, like for me, people like me who have heard her saying this 10 years back, and Dr. Tariq bringing it like to the thing, like now, it is really a wonderful thing. So with that, we want to like give the time to Mini ma'am for things. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really the joker in this whole pack, because all the others were academics and translators and writers. Like Tariq said, after all these people's work comes the publisher who knows very little and then tries to propagate. And so that's chiefly what I want to talk about, the roles and responsibilities of publishers. The thing is, in fact, I would really like to reverse the pattern that we've been following the last 10 days. I'll speak a little bit, I'll invite some questions, and I'll speak a little bit more, because I really want to know what a group like yours thinks about publishing, wants to know or knows about publishing, and how you contribute, because the next generation of editors, of thinkers and planners, because publishers are really activists of a sort. So this is, and what you just mentioned about, academia, research groups, and translation coming together. This is really the crucial thing about translation. It's no longer some sort of a minor activity, a secondary activity. And mind you, English language publishers have been not so much Indian language publishers. English language publishers have always struggled with this Western concept that somehow translation is secondary. And it's not to be taken all that seriously, just push it up. Only very recently, translation has risen to its true position as a cultural enabler, a cultural, what shall I say, almost a benefactor, like an osmotic membrane, where cultures and thoughts from different parts of the world meet and cross over. It's not just literary, though we are talking about literary translation. I'd like everyone to remember that translation is far, far, far beyond literature. All our engineering, medicine, astronomy, all these things have crossed through borders only because of translation. So these are some key points I want to make. And English language publishers in India, you must remember, come from a tradition of actually being in a position of subservience, because it was always when the English language was taught, promoted, presses set up, schools set up, and then almost in a role of patronage. The Indian language schools are also, one of the things that people always run down the Macaulay Minute and talk about how he wanted to anglicize Indians and take away their culture and all that. But one of the things he says, and very few people actually read that, what he says is, through English, other kinds of knowledge can reach India, and Indian language publishers, Indian language thinkers, Indian language teachers and schools will benefit from that when they translate. Actually, that's a portion of the minute which should be read more than once, because he did actually predict what happened later with the language. But I don't want to digress, but the thing I would say is, you see, there was a lot of government control and a lot of restrictions on the early English language publications. And after the British left, those publishing houses that were left had complete amnesia of their culture, and they were just mimicking their one-time employers, people who had left these, and they were also strongly controlled from the UK, where most of the publishing houses are headquartered. So there is this very big parental, I don't know what, it's almost like a pall, which we had to overcome. It took a very, very long time to do that. And it is only with the help of translators, Indian translators, who sensitized these publishers and editors into seeing that language is a work in progress and nothing is frozen. And when you say things like standard English, it can be challenged in so many different ways, particularly the publication of subaltern writing, where there's just no equivalence in English for some of the things, for the experiences and for the background and the cultural and social backgrounds from which these writers come. So the influx of linguistic power from those sources, and then the women's movement, again, the Ambedkar Centenary, 1990, these are all turning points. And the English literature, this is the other thing I want to say, the English literature fraternity, after the 70s and 80s, came under tremendous pressure because the rise in interest in nativism, in the women's movement, as I said, feminism, the Marxism, all these cultures and countercultures began to crowd in. Academia couldn't ignore it. They had to be discussed. In fact, some of the academics, they were not passive. Some of the academics are very active in these things. Susie Tharu, for instance. And so bringing in our own experiences, historical as well as literary, into classrooms to make things relevant. This was put a huge pressure on English literature. The committees that looked at curricula or choice of texts and so on. In all these places, a translation intervened. It held hands with all these subjects, with sociology, with anthropology, with history, with feminist, the growth of that kind of thinking, because the women's movement here didn't have the same goals as the movement in France or in the UK or in the US. Our concerns were different, and it was also closely linked with caste. So all these things actually came through, they found windows through translation to enter. So I have written a paper. I'll read it very quickly, and I'd like you to be ready with your questions, and then we'll move back and forth with something I have to say and something you have to say. I'll just minimize this, right? So just open this. Okay, I'll read this as quickly as I can to save time. Thanks for this opportunity to address a multilingual audience, all committed to the industry of translation and convinced that it is more than entertainment. I will talk about my key concern, which is the link between publishing translations and the academic acceptance and use of translations, because that's the only way it will make a significant cultural contribution and an intellectual contribution. Watching the landslides in Kerala a month ago, in which a whole house falls away, was an eerie experience. Reminded me of what is happening at the abstract and silent level, our inexorable slide into forgetfulness of our own languages. Nobody tuning into this talk needs to be told that India's linguistic map is subcontinental in nature, and that 6 language families have populated the land over millennia. Now, what are we doing with this wealth? I feel our universities are doing next to nothing to develop the language skill of students. And they're actually inheriting what happens in schools, because in schools, before a child really grasps the vocabulary, English, I'm talking about English medium schools, the child is expected to learn certain concepts. In mathematics, for instance, or even science, air has weight. It's always bothered me, that sentence. How much does that child understand these words? Translation is about the sociology of communication. Literary translation, I've got this quote from Sujit Mukherjee, not quote, I'm just paraphrasing. Literary translation is the highest form of language transfer, coming second only to the transfer of philosophy and religious texts, which are also a form of literature. It was Sujit Mukherjee, quoting George Steiner, who said, that a literary text, the actual words, a literary text yields its full meaning only to its translator, because the translator reads it over and over and over again, and has also, and I always say this, a frequent question I'm asked is, how do you choose a translator? Or how can I become a translator? How can you become a translator when you choose a text? It's not just that text. It's not floating in some vacuum. You have to know everything about that writer's background, about the political and historical context in which that book was written. Try and read as much as you can about the forces that would have acted upon the writer when he wrote those things. In other words, you have to be very, very familiar with that, what that author would have been going through while he wrote it. Where was he located, and what was the environment. I was reminded of Meenakshi Mukherjee when she was writing her PhD on Jane Austen, she spent months in the British library reading the pulp fiction and the sort of halfway good fiction and the letters to the editors in the newspapers of the time in which Jane Austen lived. Because she said, only then I'll get a full picture against which Jane Austen wrote. And the other day I read, I think it was Salman Rushdie, one of my favorite writers, not his fiction, but his prose. He said that though Jane Austen lived during the Napoleonic times, there's hardly any mention of the huge impact of the wars and the times. I mean, that political thing. So all these things you have to think about and balance as you read a text and decide, okay, I'm going to translate this. You don't just pick up a text and say, this is fun, I'll translate it. So that's one of the points. Yes. Yeah, this is something I wrote for all of you. Whichever way one looks at book life, at long last, translation is no longer a minority interest with a token presence. It is, it is soft power and perhaps the most important zone of cultural interface. The emergence of literary translation, followed by the translation of cultural writings over the last 30 years, is a result of a paradigm shift in academic disciplines concerning what I said earlier informally, the humanities, social sciences that affected literary studies quite drastically. Yeah, I'll skip all this because I kind of informally said all this. The other thing is this. You see, in the 70s, between 70 and 80, 1970 1980, something else happened. I mean, it happened really all across the country. All the middle class values, the planned economy adopted by the nation, which actually left out large sections of the population, all this invited very sharp criticism and prompted alternative systems of thinking and writing. And some sort of a dissatisfaction set in, which was caught by the Indian writers in their regional languages. It was caught by the little magazines, the literary magazines, but it was missed by the Indian writers in English. Now, this is why those who are familiar with two languages, both Kannada and English, or Tamil in English, or Hindi in English, you will know very clearly what this gap. And that's why there's also this huge debate and something sort of hostile, some sort of hostility, where you say the Indian writer in English are somehow not authentic. See, it's not that the experiences are not valid, but somehow there seems to be a slight disconnect from the context and the social, the environment in which those novels. I'm talking chiefly about novels because translation is focused so strongly on novels because of all these big prizes and so on. But I think poetry, there might be that might not be so with poetry because poetry is of a different. No, it's written at a different temperature, a different pitch, and it's hugely about emotions and not so much the material aspects of our culture. Yeah, the other thing is translation is the big link between a traditional society like us, which is moving into struggling to be born into a postmodern society. As I was saying, it's this link between a very traditional society and society that's struggling to interpret and to act out its role in a rapidly globalizing environment, both chiefly economic but also social. And because of our colonized state, we think it's the right thing to do to be unlike ourselves. There is that huge problem, which our poets, our playwrights, and novelists have tried to interpret in their works for us. Today, as you know, translations are being produced and marketed by many publishers, and it is the emergence of translation studies in the West has had its impact in India, but as an interdisciplinary field of study, translation is yet to make its presence felt. I think because this is not I think I know that this is because there is a lack of critical discourse on translation and translated material, and so it's not a stable situation. It's very exciting. It throws up a lot of new stuff for research, but academics might hesitate a little bit because none of the norms of the English literature, what should I say, backgrounds would, or that world doesn't quite fit. You can't fit these things comfortably into those frameworks, and for teaching you do need a framework. So this is something actually that the NTN can help to do, to bring publishers and the teaching community together to see what is required. And when I talk about the responsibilities of publishers, I want to say that actually it is the non-profitable books that are really important. A lot of the fiction that is published as translation is forgotten within 2 years. But if you publish a biography or an autobiography or an important travelogue, it may not sell more than 600 or 700 copies, but it's actually a very important book in terms of recording a life or recording a time. So you have to balance that against the money you need to keep yourself going and to keep the publishing going. The other thing is, increasingly I see that the quality of editing in publishing houses is dropping, because that, you see, that has a direct link with academia, with the importance given to languages, the time spent on the study of languages, the deep reading, the rereading. All this is required for your vocabulary and your word bank to develop. So all these things are linked. Nobody works in a sort of vacuum. I have what I call, I'll just talk about this. Publishing literary translations has taken 3 directions. One is state-funded, like the academies, National Book Trust. They don't have any conflicts about what they're going to publish because they publish their award-winning works. The difficulty is that there is really no marketing at all. And the other thing is, once they translate, nobody can do a fresh translation. Now, this is actually a limiting factor, because important books need to be translated once in every 10 or 15 years. Then there's the publishing of privately funded translations. The Qatar translations, the Macmillan translations were also funded. And really, the one thing about translation I can tell you is it's very difficult to run a program which is not funded. Because if a book bombs, however good, however important it is, if it doesn't do well, then it forever seals off that the person who backed that book, the editor or the marketing person who backed that writer and that book, will never again be able to publish that same writer's second book or third book. These are some of the points I wanted to bring. The other publishers who have been very active were Penguin many years ago. Then there is the kind of publishing done with a clear ideological dimension behind their choices. That was Sri Samya, Kali for Women, which is now split into Zaban and Women Unlimited, Seagull, and much more recently Navayana Books, who focused on caste. Now, handling translations, I would say for a long time, translations in independent India were not taken seriously except by scholars and researchers. But now Indian publishers, and at that time they were, as I said, Indian publishers were burdened by older norms, strongly rooted in Western theories, attitude to translation as something secondary. In fact, even research into translation or the achievement of whole translated work for a doctoral program was not encouraged. But I think now that situation is changing. I would like to end with the statement that only language and humanities academics can put a brake on the speed with which we are losing our history, losing our memories. And the second thing is, only with government support can crucial publications be possible, because publishers are under great pressure to deliver profits or close down. The past 20 months have been really quite terrible. I have a sort of a laundry list, ABC. I'll just read this out to you. One is that translation is usually and has to be better to be a bilingual teamwork, whether with a fellow translator or an editor or the author himself or herself. Some of these questions were raised after Dr. Saravanan's session. So, and he didn't hear those, the connection was bad. The other point is the impact of non-literary sources on social and cultural change is usually not given enough consideration. That is non-fiction, journals, diaries, speeches, letters by, exchanges of letters between, social leaders, thinkers. And lastly, most English language publishers, including myself, are the products of mission-run schools and colleges. So their philosophy and inner conviction about the language they publish for India is always influenced by that. And lastly, both translation and publishing are about propagation. That is, you're burning to convey something to a larger group of readers. The publishers are also, however little money is available, you'll always have editors pushing for their books. This is a book we must do. The biography of, let's say, Iyengar, this has to be done. And there'll be people on that team who say, who's Iyengar? So, you see, the thing is, there's a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of indifference to very, very important things in our past. And that's, like the landslides of Kerala, which I was watching. It really reminded me of the position we are now, that very soon we'll be faced with publishers who don't know what they don't know. So here we definitely need the help of academics who have trained minds and who can, advise us. And it's just a simple thing. See, we talk about Malayalam, Kannada, Tamil, Hindi, Bengali, but in every one of these things there are so many variants. In your own region where the NTM is located, you have two languages for which there is no script. They use other scripts as Tulu and Konkani. So you can't just say Kannada and think that you've covered the whole region. I'm just hoping that the change that came since the 80s, the attitude towards curriculum design, education philosophy in general, I'm hoping that we went through one phase where there was Commonwealth literature, and then there was Indian writing in English. That was seen as in some sense it was also an affirmation of what you might call a national seeking a national search for an identity. But this takes us deeper into ourselves, deeper into our past. And because this IWE was, of course, challenged by those who campaigned for our regional languages, saying that there were better and far more profound writings available in regional languages that had been neglected for only one reason, that they were not available in English. So there are various attitudes now, not attitudes, but strategies. One is translation. And some people say that just narrating it in English, it needn't be a translation, just a sort of adaptation, a recreation. That too is possible. So I'd like to throw this the floor open to questions, because I can probably find myself if you tell me what you want to know. So thanks very much. I'll wind up from now. Yeah. Any questions, anyone?
Can you please elaborate on the gap not filled by Indian writers in English of the 70s and 80s? The Indian writers in English of the 70s and 80s.
Uh-huh. What did they miss? What did they miss?
Yeah. This is from Dr. Annie.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. If you look at the 70s and 80s, you have Shashi Deshpande. Oh, can you please elaborate on the gap not filled by Indian writers? Yes. Yeah. Well, the Indian writers and those writers at that time, let's say there was Shashi Deshpande, there was okay, doesn't matter. Yeah. The thing is, if you tell me a particular language, I can focus a little more strongly. An Indian, can you suggest an Indian language to compare?
Malayalam.
Okay.
Malayalam or even Tamil.
Okay, that's easy.
No,
Yeah,
but I'm
Tamil.
actually looking at only Indian writers in English, people who wrote in English rather than translated into English.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the writer that immediately comes to my mind is Shashi Deshpande, because she was coming into focus at that time. Who are the? Can you mention some writers? So the books, because then I can quickly tell you from the Indian languages what they were.
See, this is when I was a student in the 80s. I remember Mulkra Janan, then.
Yeah, sure. We can stop. We can stop right there. We can stop right there. Mulkra Janan's Coolie. You know, he if you remember, I don't remember the name of that the thing, but he actually shows in Two Leaves and a Bud. He actually shows this very, very oppressed person as being grateful and happy, and the language that person uses is completely is exactly the language which is spoken by the employers or the owners of that tea factory. He has absolutely no experience really of that background. And if you look at writing in the regional language at that time, actually there was writing by marginalized people, by Dalits, but it was not brought into translation. These things are available in the OUP anthology of Tamil, the OUP anthology of Telugu, the OUP anthology of Malayalam. You have fiction. Can you just get that Malayalam anthology? There's Vadutala. There is C.K. Vadutala. Then who wrote the Catherine's translation of Kulayatara? Yeah. I'll just quickly read out. There's Vadutala, there's Chirakarod, Madhukar. These are, this is Malayalam, writing at the same time of about how, there's a particular incident. I'll quickly move on in case there are other questions. There's a scene where for the first time, a Dalit comes in as a teacher into the classroom, and the students know he's coming. And what they do is they take a spade and place it on the table of the teacher, as if to say, this is written this story was written in 1972, as if to say, this is really your work. It's not teaching. It can't be teaching. So something like this is completely missing in the Anita Desai. Fabulous writing. I mean, Anita Desai is one of my favorite writers, but this kind of experience is really missing in the IWE writers. Annie, I hope I've...
Yes, Minnie. And also those writers were mostly writing for that Western gaze, approval of the Western sensibilities. But then the translations that I read today, they're so very honest, and there is a greater deal of identity, the Indian identity coming. But then I'm also worried about this appropriation, the process of, or the concept of appropriation or misappropriation. What would you say to that, Minnie?
Which is, that is the Indian translator is too
yeah.
strongly.
There is a greater sense of identity. They're no longer, nobody is writing for the approval of the Western or, the Western sensibilities, or nobody is writing for the Western gaze anymore. But then
Okay.
there is also this trap of cultural appropriation, misappropriation. So how do we stem that?
I don't follow that too well, because you're either translated or you're not translated. Do you want to be known in the English zone, or you don't want to be known? Because some compromise you will have to accept. See, for instance, there are some. I don't want to go on harping on only Dalit writers, but there are some Dalit writers who don't want even to be labeled as Dalit writers. So they are missing in these anthologies. Publishers don't know how to describe them. There is a lot of trouble. But I want to discuss this word appropriation and misappropriation. Are you talking about the publisher appropriating or the translator appropriating?
The translator, through the process of transcreation or recreation, appropriating another culture, another identity.
Oh, I don't think so. See, a translator interprets. I think you should take a more generous view of the translator. The translator is an interpreter and a second voice, almost a ventriloquist in some sense. But you see, you can't separate milk and water. You can't say that the translator has no role at all. The translator's personality, vocabulary, emotions, all these things come into the work that he or she undertakes. If they drop material, if they refuse to translate, let's say, certain usages, if they try to soften some of the rough bits, yes, that's wrong. That's ethically wrong. And well, that's where the publisher has a role to play. The publisher has to be able to challenge the translator 10 times on every page, saying that, are you sure that you're carrying this through? And that's why that's where the role of the publisher comes in. You must have a resource person who checks every line and says, yeah, okay, I passed this. Now I leave it to you to polish the way you want. All right, everything has been carried through. But, the whole approach is, he's written everything in passive voice or something like this. That's the only way we can step in. Annie, I'll just go to the next question, which is, what were the challenges you faced?
Thanks, Minnie.
Oh, thank you, Annie. What were the challenges you faced when working on the greatest Tamil story level? Oh, first of all, the selection of writers. Obviously you can't have 50 writers. You can have only 30. The range of themes, the backgrounds. There's an article in the paper today based on the interview which the journalist ran with me and with Sujata. Selection of themes, selection of writers. There are some of these canonical writers. Then what the publisher wanted to see. For instance, I really didn't want to include Kalki and Bharati, because I don't think Kalki is famous as a short story writer. He's a novelist. And I don't think Bharati's short stories are that great, but the publisher wanted those two writers there. Then Sujata and I had many arguments about who should be represented and how many writers. And so these were the big challenges. One, which writers, and then which stories, because there were so many beautiful stories. The other sad thing was that we had to drop a great writer like Jayakantan because the family simply didn't give us permission. They felt that the translation our chosen translator had prepared was not up to the mark. What they suggested was not acceptable to us, so we had to drop that writer. Any other questions, anyone? Has anyone translated anything? Is there anything on offer?
Too scared to get into that. Because one has to be proficient in both the languages, and not just proficiency in the language, but also the culture and...
Yeah. But increasingly, Annie, I feel, and this I'm saying to everybody here, work with another person. Work with another person. Let the first draft be done by someone who knows the source language really well. Then you polish. I mean, how was the Bible translated? So many, 3 or 4 groups, one in London, one in Oxford, one somewhere else. So don't think that everything you have to produce all the answers. That's yes, Panda. That publishers are mostly market driven and they're mostly interested in publication. The world of minor languages, minority systems to figure out how to reduce the gap between those sort of and these sort of. I think all languages sought after, but the thing is, Dr. Panda, that as I said earlier, without some kind of state funding, without some kind of encouragement in terms of sponsorship or of grants or something, publishers find it very difficult to cover the whole gamut. So since you have this thing, a background of NTM, and you have, I'm sure, your sources and contacts in government, go to your culture secretary, go to your education secretary, say that we should all work together, give us a fund which we can use to develop the kind of work, autobiographies, fiction, poetry. Just keep it for the minor, the languages, I don't say minor, but less well-known languages, less propagated languages, and say we want to concentrate on building up translations in these languages, because anyway publishers are looking at the major, very highly developed languages. Create a fund, then approach publishers and say, approach 5 or 6 publishers and say, will each of you do one book from this language if we develop the translated script and offer it to you? That's one of the things that you can do, but you must have funding. What translation have you enjoyed recently? My question is to all of you. Anyone?
Nanjil Nadan's Forest.
Oh, I see. Okay. Translated by?
I don't remember, but then...
Look at that. You don't remember your translator's name.
Right now, I'm not able to get it.
Okay.
It was published in the Indian Quarterly.
Oh, I see. All right. Do any of you see the Frontline magazine? Because once a month I run a short story translated in it. I was hoping that students would pick it up and perhaps discuss it in class or something. In the next issue, I'm running a story by an Adivasi writer, Narayan. He's written about, we can all see around us the climate change and the earthquakes. In this, there's a fabulous, huge jackfruit tree in his just outside his house, and it's been shading the house, shading them. There's a little stream, but his son wants to bring down that tree and use the money to sell the tree and use that money to buy rubber plant saplings, and how the whole environment changes. It becomes so hot, the stream dries up, there's no shade, there's no jackfruit or anything for them to eat. And it's actually a metaphor for the change in the tribal habitat and the lifestyle. It's coming in the next issue of the Frontline. I'll send it to you, Tariq, if Tariq can send it to this group. Oh, the translator for us is Geeta Subramanian. Okay. The same person who translated Pethavan.
My favorite translator is that Anirudh Vasudevan. One part woman. I have not read a better translation than that.
Really?
And even this mustache.
Oof! What a book, Harish. Yeah. In fact, some of those sentences, those paragraphs, I read it more than once because I was wondering how she translated. How she moves from the real to the surreal, and then something totally, that whole thing about the whole world being in that mustache and just crossing a river the way I almost think that the translation is probably better than not better, but somehow
it was like reading a new novel altogether.
Yeah, so radiant in so many places. I don't know how she did it. She said she was always talking to the author and always in touch.
I also like Benjamin's Goat Days and Jasmine Days. That's also good.
Jasmine Days was very good. Goat Days is a fabulous story, but it was a very, very poor translation.
Why do you say so many? I'm so curious to know. Why do you say it's a poor translation? I thought it was a good one, especially the snakes in the sand. Oh my God.
Yeah. No, it could have been. What I'm saying is the power of the original is so great that it came through even that poor translation.
Oh,
From somewhere I'll pull up a. I'll just edit one page and send it to you.
okay.
Goat Days. Jasmine Days, Jasmine Days, of course, won a prize. I would say that the translator has written her own book. It's, there you have a translator who's played a very strong role, but very, very delicately brought through. It's much more journalistic than Goat Days. Goat Days, there's no other book like it. It's, I don't know, it went through some 80 editions, reprints or something in just 4 or 5 years. Liked Gachar Gochar. Gachar Gochar is an easy work to translate and to read. If you change, if you say taco instead of dosa, it could be anyway. It's not, it doesn't have any great depth. Nobody's got any thing to offer on autobiographies, biographies. Nobody's read anything recently.
Not many dramatic narratives that are translated, isn't it?
You mean plays?
Plays.
Yeah, well, Seagull did a great deal. Oxford has done Girish Karnad and a couple of other plays, but there isn't really an Indrapad Sathi's plays. Ramanujar, the Nandan legend of Nandan.
And Komal Swaminathan's Water by Shankar.
And where do you see, like, between Indian languages, the translation between Indian languages role?
Sorry, is that a question or a comment?
It's a question, like, how do you see the role of, translation between Indian languages, or what is their position now? Like you see, okay, all these things are coming up in English, of course.
Yes.
But
no, I didn't preface my comments by saying that I would be talking only about what I have experienced in, but the transfers between Indian languages has always been very, very fluid and very vigorous. But the problem is that there is no professional editing, not much in those languages. So a great deal, of course, much easier to move Tamil Malayalam or Telugu Malayalam or Kannada Malayalam, because they are all of them have Sanskrit sort of base. Tamil is, of course, entirely different, but it's far easier to move among the Dravidian languages and between, say, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi. I'm sure there's a lot of traffic, but the publishers themselves are not very professional. I don't know if they pay their translators properly. That might be a deterrent. And then the way it is promoted. I'm sure it spreads a lot of literature, encourages a lot of reading. But how much rigor there is, I'm not very sure. And that's where we're failing, because the comparative studies actually depends on translation. And comparative studies, which India poured money, so many famous scholars, Cecil Kumar Das, I've just ordered his book, 2 volumes, not the third, from Sahitya Academy. Amiya Dev, Nabanita Devsen, they all did so much of work. But we've not really been able to move ahead with that, largely because our bilingualism dipped. But I'd like to tell you a little story. We're talking about, say, moving into the regional language. So I'll end with this. I have a friend who runs the Hyderabad Book Trust in Hyderabad. Her name is Geeta Ramaswamy, and she translates. She publishes in English, and she also translates important books into Telugu and takes it into the small towns, villages. She had taken what she does is she just drives out. She waits for the evening because all the villagers will be a little free after when the evening sets in. Puts up her tables, lights a lantern, and puts out her books. And she was promoting a book called uh, David Werner's book called "Where There Is No Doctor," and in Telugu it is called Vaidyadu Lenichodu. If there are Telugu speakers, you can correct me. And a farmer came, parked his cycle, and kept on going through the book. And then the price of the book was 120 rupees. And he cycled off. A little later, he came with 3 others. They also looked at the book. Each of them contributed enough money to make up the 120 rupees. And they said, we'll take turns reading this book. So Geeta was saying, she felt somehow that this is somehow symbolic of our country. That is, it's a needy market, not an affluent market. But there is a great deal of interest in materials which work directly in their lives. I would really like to end with that comment about publishers, about the role of translation, about what it does for people who don't have access to the original language. And that is really the moot point here. One of the questions which the journalist asked me about this book, Greatest Tamil Stories, is, what does it do for the Tamil public? What is the market there? So I said the greatest sale of translated work is into that same language, because there are so many people whose schooling through an English medium system has deprived them of their mother tongues. But they're very comfortable in their cultures. They speak the language extremely well. They think in it, they dream in it. They can't read it. So that's the primary market for translations into English. I think they printed that answer, but I think she's put it across as her answer. I mean, her reading of the situation. So
we have other evidences of this kind of readership that you're talking about. Like, for instance, this book by A.R. Venkatachalapati, When There Was No Coffee. He has produced the same, like he has written it in Tamil also. Andha kalathil copy illai. Okay, this is probably like he himself has written it in English as well as in Tamil. And most of the English readers are also Tamil people.
Right, I see. It would be, yeah. People really enjoy seeing themselves in their culture. His research, his PhD work, which Permanent Black published as The Province of the Book, which is the history of the book in Tamil.
Yes.
The early. That book also, he adapted into 2 other books in Tamil, and they published by Kalichoda. The early printing, it's very interesting how the early, the books, the way they were released. It was always released almost like a religious festival. And there had to be a sponsor, a patron. His name would be printed. His name would be on the invitation card, sometimes not even the name of the book. And how it would start in the evening and, proceed very grandly, and all the gods would be invoked. Those release functions in those days are really something to read about. And the role of Uvesa, how he was the first person who asked government for money for publishing, and saying that you have to support researchers and scribes and copyists and translators in order to build a corpus of Tamil works. The history of publishing and printing in Tamil Nadu. But there's the Tamil version also. He himself rewrote.
Just an aside.
Yes.
Since you talked about Geeta Ramaswamy, National Translation Mission's first translation was published by Geeta Ramaswamy.
Really? What was it?
Indian Constitution, the Cornerstone of Nation by Granville Austin, because we publish knowledge texts.
Yes.
So the first, that book was translated into Telugu and she published it.
I see.
Just now.